Welcome back. We are on video number 2 of our new series called Seriously, which is based on Skye Jethani's book, What If Jesus Was Serious, which takes a deep dive into Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Now, we're about halfway through the book because we did part of it last year.
That's right.
And we're continuing on. And so we're looking at Matthew chapter 6 today. And in this particular podcast today, we're looking at 3 aspects of our relationship with God that we can incorporate into our daily lives. And it's based on the Lord's Prayer. So the first thing we want to look at is intimacy. So this is a interesting subject for sure when it comes to our relationship with God. And if we sort of contrast that to our culture today, obviously our culture is very enamored with celebrity.
Very true.
And we see this ordinary people like ourselves trying to be celebrities in our own social circles, particularly on social media.
That's right, and it becomes a kind of an interesting thing that the things that we all do. Let's put ourselves in the category to really get attention. There's some crazy things if you look at what we do just to get the almighty like.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also, if I'm honest, I don't put my whole life on there. I tend to put on the good parts of my life because I don't always want people to see or to comment or whatever on the parts of my life that one are private, but 2 maybe that aren't as good as what I'd hope they would be. So yeah, I think that's the thing is we really want to get the likes. And I think the underlying problem there is that sometimes I think we only believe our lives matter when people notice us.
Well, yeah, and I think that becomes kind of the big thing is about being noticed, and it's really not about, what you talk about, the likes, the follows, whatever that is, and not so much about growth and maturity and transformation and ultimately becoming more like Jesus.
And I think that comes down to sort of a basic human need to know that we matter, that our existence counts for something.
Yeah, I don't think we don't want to draw back to like significance is nothing. I think it's what we become significant for.
Sure. Yeah, I think it is a need, and this is, I guess, one way to scratch it is the social media side. Mm-hmm. But I think when Jesus was teaching us the Lord's Prayer, he very specifically instructs us to pray in private and not to pray publicly to get attention. Mm-hmm. And then to say, if you sort of read between the lines there, that he's maybe saying that what happens in private when it comes to maturity and growth is way more important than what happens publicly. We've talked about this before, the idea that what's happening inside us, the changes we're going through are more important than necessarily what we display. Now, I think we've also talked about the idea that eventually that does come out in our actions. But it reminds me of kind of a funny story when I was a kid. And it's about 2 people that I remember praying. And the first one was, I remember our pastor at the time, he would sometimes, occasionally on a Sunday when it was time to publicly pray, he would invite someone from the community to come up and pray. Right. And quite often he would invite this gentleman up. He was a former pastor and he was retired. And I remember he kind of had sweepy white gray hair, and he always wore a suit and a tie. Mostly all did back then, even kids. And he walked very confidently, and they had a little podium or pulpit there, and he would grab the pulpit with 2 hands, and he would give his head a little shake, and he would pray these very eloquent and powerful prayers, and he could modulate his voice and how loud his voice was and the pitch and stuff, so that it just was very, I'm going to use the word entertaining to listen to, but it certainly captivated everybody's attention. But for the life of me, I can't remember a single word he ever prayed. Now I'm going to contrast that with another time I remember. It was at the same church, and I was about 10 years old. In both cases, I guess that would be true. That gentleman, if he hasn't passed on, is probably still at that church, coming up to pray on occasional Sundays. But this other time was I was part of a boys' club, and we would meet on Tuesday nights, if I remember right. And I remember we used to love to play floor hockey, and as boys tend to be, they can be a little bit rough, and it was very much full contact. And I remember one time, I forget the exact circumstances, but one of the boys just ran head first into the wall. And he was sitting there. I don't know if he was completely knocked out, like totally, passed out, but he was near unconscious.
Right.
So and I remember one of the leaders picking him up, and they took him over to the sidelines. And I distinctly remember my cousin asking, "Do you know first aid?" And the gentleman says, "No, I don't, but I know someone who does." And he laid his hands on the guy's head and he started to pray for him. And it was a very, I don't remember the exact words, but I remember it was very simple. And he just asked that the boy would be okay, and that Jesus would touch his body, and that he would regain consciousness, and that we would, be able to get him to his parents and take him to the hospital to get checked out. And within a few seconds, the guy kind of came to, and, we can look back at that and say it was just coincidence. But for me as a 10-year-old witnessing that gentleman and his very sincere prayer, and that was the first thing that he did in the circumstance once he determined the guy was still breathing, kind of thing,
right.
Was to pray. And my faith actually grew a little bit that day.
Right. Well, I think it's really important also in all that is just, I think people could possibly hear us say that if someone is just a well-spoken individual,
yep,
they shouldn't pray or something like that, or it's all about them. We're definitely not saying that. There are just some people who are incredibly well-spoken, but is the intent about draw attention to me, or draw attention to God, which is what hopefully it is, and not to just sort of like, oh, hey, that person is a great communicator or a great and just it's anything that is really comes down to intention. And and I think like we definitely in that last story, is definitely that wasn't about, hey, look at me. It was about, God, can you do something?
God, we need help in that case. And I think if we look back to Jesus' time, now obviously in Jesus' time is a very different culture than ours. And I know that Jesus often criticized the group of religious leaders called the Pharisees for their public prayers. And I didn't really understand what that was. I mean, you read it and you're thinking, well, where were they? We only have our context where we kind of have the guy who got up to the pulpit and prayed on a Sunday. And turns out when I was watching the TV miniseries, it's called The Chosen.
Right.
They actually have a little scene in there where two Pharisees are trying to get the attention of another Pharisee, but he's actually on the street corner praying. And he's praying eloquent prayer. And he's praying very loudly, and he's praying to be seen. And these guys are trying to interrupt him to get his attention because they have something urgent to tell him. And he literally puts them off. He just kind of ignores them at first. And finally he gives them the hand to wait till he's done. And they literally would not speak to him until he was finished his prayer. And so I thought that was just a wonderful way to picture that, in that you could see very clearly what Jesus meant about them praying in public to get attention for themselves.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's really important to note too that, this does lead into Jesus teaching them the Our Father. And it's a simple prayer. Like it's not long.
Yep.
It's not, there's not a big use of whatever impressive words, or deep, even though I would say it is ultimately deeply theological, but not like this sort of like you wrote a dissertation on this, on this prayer. And cause he is responding to the religious leaders, even the Gentile leaders, cause he is responding to essentially what they've witnessed. And it's whether it's these long-winded, eloquent, not eloquent, probably the wrong word to say that. It can be eloquent, but these long-winded, look at me how important I am prayers, or the resuscitation of, certain things that somehow will, elicit whatever God they might be talking to at the moment. Just trying to say, hopefully one of these things is the right thing. And here's this simple prayer.
Yeah, and it becomes very transactional, I think, sometimes when they're recited in that way. And you're right, this is a very simple prayer in common language that may have deeper meanings, but it's still very easy to hear and understand on the surface as well.
That's right.
And I think that reminds me of a psalm that David wrote. It's a beautiful poem, and if you've read the Psalms ever, it's likely familiar. It says, "O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts, even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say, even before I say it. Lord, you go before me and you follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head." So there really isn't any place we can go that God isn't aware of us. Right. And so we don't have to grandstand to get his attention.
Right. We don't have to, we don't necessarily have to, this is what we're looking for. Let me break down the story for you.
Yeah.
Okay. This takes place on a Friday. So 8 Fridays before, just like this, I need everything in context prayer. It's just sort of like, hey, Lord, we need your help on this.
And just to kind of wrap it up here a little bit, Skye goes on to say that the more we develop this kind of intimacy with God, the less we will strive for the affirmation and attention of others. And I think that kind of helps us get to the point where we need to develop a life that makes room for intimacy with God.
That's right.
And I was actually listening to a podcast this week where Carrie Newhoff was interviewing John Eldridge. He's the author of Wild at Heart, if you might remember that book was popular a while ago. And he was explaining that coming out of the pandemic, we might think we're okay, that we're actually feeling better than we were, and we don't have to do the masks and stuff that we did, and the COVID is obviously still around, but we're getting this sense that it's kind of over. But he said we've gone through so much trauma that we don't even necessarily realize that we're still dealing with it.
Right.
And he gave a bunch of symptoms, and I'm like, oh, I do that. I do that too. Maybe things not are as okay with me as I think they are. And he was saying that the way to, or sort of the solution to that is what we've been talking about here, this intimacy with God,
right,
is making time to actually get down. He was calling it time for stillness, which I think is interesting, or quiet. And when we spend that kind of time and just sort of picture ourselves with Jesus and ask him to, give us what we need for today, which is part of the Lord's Prayer as well, that's where the healing from trauma can actually come from. And I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes today, because it was a very powerful podcast that when I was listening to it, hey, that kind of fits in with what we're talking about today. So I would encourage you to give it a listen. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about that the Lord's Prayer kind of refers to is community. So if you're following along, we actually get into the part now where Jesus is teaching us the Lord's Prayer. And before we even get into the actual wording of the Lord's Prayer, it's interesting to note that all the pronouns in the prayer are plural.
Yeah.
There's no I or me or my. It's only our and us. So why is that significant?
Well, it is about community, and that's really a big deal, especially for this culture in that moment. It is a collective culture, not an individualistic culture like we are, and so there is an understanding that we relate to, and yes, we do relate to God, and they would relate to God on an individual level, but there's such an importance put on a community level aspect, and even some commentators really make the note where they like that because it's written down, because it's actually kind of one of the the prayers throughout Christianity, the history of it, that has been kind of that staple, because it's right there in the Bible, that even when we do it, we'll say it individually, we can imagine ourselves, we're saying this with many other cultures, Christian, throughout the world currently, that would pray this, as well as throughout history.
Yeah.
And it does bring us together.
It really does.
In a community, even through time and space.
And I just want to touch on the part you said about being an individualistic culture. Ours is definitely like that. And we've heard a lot of talk about freedom in the news lately. And I think that's come to mean not just freedom from oppression, but freedom from other people as well. So
just let me do what I want.
Yeah, let me do what I want. It feeds into that individualistic. And I think that is really not part of what Jesus teaches. He's teaching that the prayer assumes, because of the pronouns, that we are connected, like you said, that we are a community of Jesus followers. And even when we pray alone, it's never really just a private activity, because we're forever connected to the people that, like you say, that are Christians and other followers of Jesus in other places, other denominations, and even in, like you said, in history, those that have gone before us, and even those who will come after us. I think it is, we're all saying, when we repeat the Lord's Prayer, we're saying the same thing, and we're inviting God to help us learn all the things that we're exploring
That's
here.
right.
And I think, again, prayer is a place then of communion with each other and with God, and not just a way to draw attention to oneself. And I know the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the churches in Ephesus, encourages followers there to strive for the unity, this unity that Jesus talked about. And the way he does that, he reminds them what they have in common. Ephesians 4:3-6 says, "Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, bonding yourselves together with peace, for there is one body, one Spirit, just as you've been called to one glorious hope for the future. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all." So that's a lot of oneness in that there that he's encouraging us to.
Well, yeah, and it is so important that I think we're so, and I'm not saying it's all bad. I want to make sure that, but we're so very much about looking at the differences and what makes us unique, which I think there is very good things in that. But like to sit there and say, but what brings us together? Yeah. What brings, and there is so much of that with the idea of, like, hey, we all need forgiveness, like that's part of the prayer. We all are in need of things every day, and just all those things. These are the common things that we just need together, no matter who you are.
And that's what unites us. And I think a good metaphor for that is actually family. So in the Old Testament, God calls a nation, the nation of Israel, but in the New Testament, Jesus really has this sort of connection that's more like a family, which has become the church of Jesus across the world. And I think, again, that's what really unites us. But to me, it's helpful to think of it as being part of God's family.
Yeah. And then we're talking about some mystery here. Hey?
Yeah,
it's one of my favorite subjects lately, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would say in the past, this was the part that I didn't ignore it, but because I couldn't maybe have a rational explanation for everything, and I think that's a natural tendency. We want to be able to explain things. But I really like the way in the book Skye brings this whole idea out that some things we just can't know. And even in this first part here, like the first parts of the prayer, Our Father, which art in heaven. So, and he uses, usually I just jump past this part because it seems very straightforward, but Jesus is actually contrasting two big ideas here. Our Father in heaven, and may your name be kept holy. So the word for father here is like Abba in the original language, which is a term of endearment. It's like dad or daddy, depending on how your relationship is with your own father, rather than formal like father, like you might refer to your father when you're speaking to someone else out of a sign of respect when you're talking about your father. And then so there's that sort of intimate, tender part. And then he talks about what he recognizes God as being holy. So what does that even mean?
Yeah, well, and I think that does add that, and really, I want to go back to this mystery because hopefully this makes sense. Because I know when I think of mystery, it's growing up as Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
It's to solve the mystery.
Yeah, solve the mystery.
And really the mystery in this sense is that there can be things held in tension.
Yeah.
And so as much as there's this intimate, I can know God, holy is this set apartness and this bit, it moves to this bigger that I, as much as I can know him, there's so much more.
Yeah.
That is unknowable because he's that big and that huge and stuff like that. And so it's holding those two things in tension.
Yeah, and that's really what holy means. It means separate and unique.
Yeah.
And God is so unique that it's really, we can't really comprehend all of him based on what our science and what we know. And I think the way that I found very helpful to understand it is in the Bible Project video that Tim Mackey explains what God's holiness is he says that God is powerful and unique, literally meaning holy. He likened it to being like the sun in our universe.
Right.
So the sun in our universe is unique. There isn't another planet like it. It's the only star in our particular solar system, and it provides life and light to our planet. But if we were to get too close to the sun, it would burn us up. Yeah. It's very powerful. It's very big, and we can't know really all that's going on in the sun based on just being able to observe it.
Right.
And so I thought that was a great way to show that there's the same thing can appear two different ways that aren't, like you say, it creates a tension. Mm-hmm. I don't want to get too close to it, and yet I wouldn't want to be without its light either in our planet.
Yeah, well, and so maybe just for everyone, we should link that too.
Yep, absolutely.
Because there's something in the visuals of that. I think that
it's very,
especially if you're a visual learner.
Yeah.
It would probably help understand.
Makes it easy to understand. Yeah.
And even though you might fully not understand it, because it's the whole point. The holding intention is that is the idea of like, hey, you're going to get it, kinda.
Yeah. And I think it's not like he explains what God is, but it explains the tension. Yeah. And I think how we respond to that tension lots of times when faced with a paradox like that, it's this, and they're very different, is we tend to focus on the thing that we like or that we understand.
Yeah, that we can explain well.
It makes sense to us. Yeah. And of course, if we had to choose between the two, we would probably pick the one, I want God to be my Heavenly Father, my daddy, the one I can go to. And I might ignore the unique, powerful God that might be a little bit dangerous to me. Mm-hmm. But I think when we try and confine God this way, it really makes God less. It puts him in a box. Yeah. And when we do that, it really, I think Skye calls it being a false God that usually is created in our image because that's what we can understand.
Yeah, and that's kind of a interesting way to say it. Like, and I believe it, but it's the false God, and it's really, I can't remember who said it. I'm probably going to say it badly. I think it was Jim Wilder. Something of the idea is if you can fully understand. If you can fully understand God, you've got a small God.
Yeah. Well,
something like that. Skye I probably butchered that.
Yeah. It's actually a really good point because Jesus is inviting us to pray to the have a true vision of God when we pray to him. And that vision is both tender and terrifying. Something we can't completely understand. And I really like how he kind of summed up the chapter. Rather than comprehend him, that's God, we are invited to fall down and worship before a God who is holy, who is a holy bonfire of love. Only such a God is worthy of my prayer because any God, this is back to what you said, I can fully understand can be no greater than myself.
Oh, maybe I just...
No, what you were saying was a little bit different.
Yeah, I'm sure maybe I just reworded Skye Jethani. I was so sure it was someone else.
We limit God to what we can understand, and that just makes him us, and or no greater than us. And that is, I'm not sure that's a God that's worthy of worship.
No, it definitely isn't. Well, if I hope you're reading this book. What if Jesus was serious with us as we go through it? Just for any highlight in case we missed it, this was kind of just a very, very big overview of 29, 30, and 30 chapters 29, 30, and 31 of that book. And then just basically kind of the first little bit of actually Our Father itself. We will in the next video talk a little further about other parts of the Our Father and in the next couple chapters in What If Jesus was serious. And so we hope that you are engaging with that. There are some questions, a question or two, I guess, in relation to this, just for further thinking, for further contemplation, to have a discussion, whether it's with a friend or missional community, just to really go further in this idea and challenging each other to this identity that Jesus is laying out in the Sermon on the Mount. So, and again, if you're doing that, or we encourage you to be reading chapter 6 of Matthew chapter 6. in the Bible. And again, this is just the chapters in here. So have a great week.